We are happy to tell everybody how they've got it wrong, and very infrequently look to ourselves or in the mirror and say, what do I need to do? And what the great beauty of the Republic was to create a place where there was breathing room for all sorts of varieties of opinions. If we hadn't figured out then how to come together and overcome those, we would have never been created.
My wife hates watching movies with me unless we're in a movie theater, because I typically get occupied doing something else. My attention gets diverted, and we're about an hour in when I suddenly look up and say, wait, where did the aliens come from? She says, this is what the whole movie's been about. Except when I'm watching Ken Burns' documentary films and series. I'm sure that there's bound to be, by the law of averages, a bad one sometime coming in the future, but I haven't seen it yet, despite the fact that they're on such a wide range of historical questions, from the Civil War to jazz to Vietnam to my favorite, country music, to now a really amazing series called The American Revolution, which I've seen ahead of time, but you can see premiering on PBS on November the 16th. And so I wanted to have Ken Burns on to talk about why now the American Revolution, and what should Americans of all sorts, and American Christians maybe particularly, think about what happened and how to conserve it. Ken Burns, thanks so much for being with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. You know, the funny thing about the word now in your question is that I started working on this in December of 2015.
Oh, wow.
That means that when it's broadcast on November 16th and available free for streaming as well, it will be 9 years and 11 months of work on it. So there's not a now, there's a deep, abiding curiosity about what happened. It's pre-photographic, no photographs, no newsreels. They're wearing buckles on their shoes.
Yeah.
They've got stockings and breeches and powdered wigs in some cases and waistcoats. And so we think they're somehow different from us, and they're not. And I think particularly at times of stress, both individually but also nationally, it's good to go back to your origin story and ask some essential questions that your pastor or a professional would ask you if you were personally in crisis. You know, where'd you come from? Who are your parents? What was your growing up like? A kind of a way to reassemble and kind of configure your own narrative. And I think our revolution has been smothered in kind of gallant, bloodless myth that we forget how incredibly important it is. And I ended up on the road a few months ago, and I suddenly said to the audience, not out of provocation, but out of hoping to sponsor some real conversations, I said, I think the American Revolution is the most important event since the birth of Christ in world history. And that there's a kind of shock and a willingness, and some will engage in an argument or a discussion about, well, isn't this or isn't that? And my feeling is that before the revolution, most people were under authoritarian rule. And suddenly we'd created this new class called citizens. And that made all the difference. We were also the first country that was celebrating and tolerating religious diversity. And so it's a wonderful moment. The colonies have collected, and they've grown in large measure because they've fled Europe for religious persecution. They've come here. Some people felt that, for example, in Massachusetts, the Mathers were persecuting them, and so Rhode Island is started by Roger Williams, Anne Hutchinson herself. So you have all of these different faiths or varieties of Protestantism sort of playing out, experimenting, and an insistence at the kind of granular level, so that by the time we start our country after the success of the revolution and after the Constitutional Convention and its ratification, is that we would add, these 10 amendments right away that would help to lock in some of the things that the colonists and later the citizens of the United States felt they had been fighting for. And the first one is, of course, the First Amendment, which does not establish any religion. The founders had seen that those states in which a particular religion was sponsored or selected, then increase the chances that those who didn't believe particularly in that would be persecuted. And so what we were, as Thomas Paine said, an asylum for mankind, where everybody could come, not just Protestant denominations, but Catholic. There were Jews who came over. Many Muslims came on slave ships, but also in emigration, and brought lots of different kinds of faiths. And so it's a pretty wonderful story. People don't want to talk too much about that, and our film is largely about the revolution itself, the series of battles, the complexity of the individuals, the taking the opacity of the founding fathers off so that they feel real and somebody that you might know, but also introducing scores of other people that I think are important to understand in the course of this. So it's been just an amazing ride for nearly 10 years, and I've been traveling all across the country, and I've been speaking to every possible variety of Americans, and I've said the exact same thing. You know, I talked to Joe Rogan, said the same thing to Joe Rogan as I said to the New York Times. I spoke to inner city kids in Charleston and Detroit and groups of people all around the country just coming to collect. We just had 8,000 people at Mount Vernon last week looking at a big inflatable screen showing an hour's worth of clips, and it started rain in the next to the last clip and nobody left. It was like, okay, if they can survive Valley Forge, then I can watch, 10 more minutes while the rain is coming down. And I think what it proved to me is that for all of the differences that we're talking about right now, how divided we are, first of all, the revolution was a much more divided time, those differences are a mile wide, but a kind of an inch thick. And so when you have a chance to revisit and have access to and potentially revitalize the founding story, like why we were created, where very few countries know exactly when they were born. We know the day, we know the month, we know the city, and we know what it's about. That we can perhaps find a way through difficult and perilous times by sort of reaffirming our beliefs in what the founders were doing. And that's our job. They were always talking about the unborn millions. They were talking about you and me and everyone listening to us. They were thinking about their posterity, and so too we must by obligation be thinking about our posterity. And the free electron, the word that floats throughout the series, not written by us, but by voices, is the word virtue. It's all about character. It's all about, when we say the pursuit of happiness, Americans have been debating about it. Is it the acquisition of wealth? The founders felt almost to a person that it was about lifelong learning, that in order to earn and keep this extraordinary gift of citizenship, you had to be engaged in lifelong learning. And there's moments, John Adams, for example, who despairs. He says, I wonder, is there too much avarice and ambition, too much greed, too much lust for profit? Is there not enough virtue for us to sustain this republic? So he's looking for us to say, look, Jefferson says it in the Declaration, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. Not hard to parse. It just means that heretofore everyone has been under authoritarian rule, and now we're creating this new thing called citizens, and it's going to require extra energy, and it's going to require an extra vigilance, not just about everybody else. I mean, Mark Twain said, nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits, right? We're always good at telling other people that they're not doing the right thing, but a kind of call to self-perfection. Impossible, of course, but that's where you move towards. And at the heart of it is a deep spirituality among so many of the founders. different than what we think and sort of apply to them today, using our own political biases to sort of decide things retrospectively, but a deep, deep abiding faith in a supreme architect, divine providence, the God, whatever the language that was used. It's a wonderful time in which, as Thomas Paine said, not since the time of Noah do we have a time to get it right. So what happens with Noah? The world is wiped out except for a handful of people and all the animals, right? And then you start again. So he was really feeling that this was the restart button for civilization.
I find it really interesting that you compare this project to a person asking, where did I come from? What's the background? Because I've had counselors and psychologists and psychiatrists tell me that when they're talking to a person, if someone says, I had a really awful childhood background, typically they're telling the truth. But they also get concerned if someone paints an idyllic picture. Everything was perfect. Yeah, because that's typically somebody who can't really handle the really complicated nature of it, and they're trying to retreat into an illusion. Don't you find that to be a difficulty with this too? When we're talking about, especially we're talking about the origin of our country, is either to have heroes, George Washington and the cherry tree, so forth, or kind of what 1619 Project and other things have done, which is to say, no, this was fundamentally flawed all the way through.
So the thing is that you want to do is you don't want to superimpose any particular lens through which you're going to see it. You just want to call balls and strikes. Mm-hmm. And you use the word hero. It's an interesting and perfect example, because I agree with you completely. That person who is, everything was perfect, is of course vulnerable to self-delusion, right? Mm-hmm. It's not. Life is tough and none of us get out of here alive, right? And so, that's our thing. So hero, we borrow from the Greeks, and hero was never perfection. It was always a complex negotiation, sometimes a war within that person over their great strengths and weaknesses. Achilles had his heel and his hubris, as well as his great strengths. And so to tell a complex story is to be redundant. All stories are complex because human beings are complex. No one is perfect because everyone is flawed and imperfect. And so if you are going to sort of subscribe to the old sort of bankrupt, as you would say, chopping down the cherry tree sort of mythology, you've really limited it. And that's why so many people just don't like history. It doesn't have a feel to it. At the same time, a lot of people don't like history because that unforgiving revisionism has come in and just thrown every baby out with every bit of bathwater. And that's not just what it is. I'm a big fan of the game of baseball, and I use a baseball analogy, not just calling balls and strikes. But we live in a world right now where everything is rather superficial and rather binary, right? It's either good or bad, it's young or old, it's rich or poor, it's red state or blue, whatever it is. We love to create these false binaries. We're dialectically preoccupied. But we have this world in which the flaws are important to understand. Babe Ruth, if in the highlight reel film of our, social media world, he always hits a home run. Mm-hmm. But Babe Ruth struck out as many times as he hit a home run. And guess what? He only came up to bat once every 9 times. And as the last World Series would tell you, sometimes it's a middle infielder, a second baseman that nobody's heralded, who becomes the hero of a particular moment. And so I think it's important. George Washington, without him, we don't have a country. Our film is explicit about this, and it is said over and over again, and quite forcefully twice by 2 African American historians, which speaks to your concern about the lens of 1619, which is we've freed ourselves of that because we don't subscribe to any particular view of history. We want to bring in all the complicated stories. But George Washington is flawed, as you and I are flawed. He makes some rash decision, riding out in the battlefield, risking his life and therefore the entire cause, because without him, we don't survive. He makes a couple, at least 2, really super bad tactical errors that loses the biggest battle of the Revolution, the Battle of Long Island, by not guarding his left flank, and repeats it again at Brandywine in Pennsylvania by not covering his right flank. This is a surveyor in addition to a general. He should have known, and he didn't. but he knew how to talk to people. He knew how to pick executive, he knew how to he could pick subordinate talent. He could inspire people in the dead of night. He knew how to defer to Congress. He knew how to tell someone from Georgia and someone from Massachusetts, yeah, it feels like two different countries, but you're actually this new thing, an American. And then he gave up power twice, resigned his military commission in 1783 and the presidency at the end of his second term, setting in motion this humility, reminding us that the highest office of the land is citizen. But with that comes enormous responsibilities. And that's, I think, one of the big sort of takeaways of the thing. You don't have to subscribe to any one particular view. You just say, yep. I have in the editing room a neon sign in lowercase cursive. It says, it's complicated.
Where did Washington get that inclination that you're talking about here? Because, of course, he had no predecessors to mimic. And one would think that there would be people who would be saying, look, if you're not here, someone worse than you will be here. And if you don't have a steady hand guiding the country with power, that's going to be endangering to the country later on. What about his background enabled him to be able to choose this path?
Yeah, it's so complicated. There's an opacity to him. He's taller than everyone else, so there's a dignity, and he must have noticed early on that could be exploited, right? And that he could walk in, when he walked into a room, everybody's attention was on him, but he never misused it. And there were people who wanted him to become the kind of military dictator after the revolution. George will fix it. He will do this. There were even some mutinies when he refused to do that he was able to put down just with a word here or a word there. It's a great gift to all of us, and it remains as so many mysteries of the cosmos. Exquisitely unable to describe it. There's something about his demeanor. He was very well read. He was one of the richest men in the world, in the country. And so you think about, particularly today, with all the selfishness and indulgence, at the end of the Declaration, they say, we mutually pledge to each other our lives. Now, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that, never fired a gun in anger during the Revolution, nor did Benjamin Franklin, nor did John Adams. But George Washington did, and Alexander Hamilton did. And they risked their lives. He was in a tent. George Washington was in a tent for most of the Revolution, which is 6.5 years, not at the comfort of mind. And he risked his entire fortune, of course. And then you get to the sacred honor. And that's where I think all of us should be asking ourselves right now, what does that mean? Is it about all me? Is the sort of maniacal narcissism of our social media moments, right? Where you don't go to a place, you take a picture of yourself at the place. What happened to the place? What happened to the Sistine Chapel or the Brooklyn Bridge? What happened to the Washington Monument or the Magna Carta? No, it's me here, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that there's something about Washington and something about the story of the revolution and a lot of the people who are together, not just the so-called founding fathers, but everybody who's participated. What causes John Greenwood, a 14-year-old kid, to join the patriot cause at 14? Or Joseph Plum Martin from Connecticut, 15 years old, and he's there the whole time. He's the classic grunt, the GI who does it through. He's the first over the abattis, the spiked logs at Redoubt number 10 at Yorktown, which is the final thing they got to take in order to haul in the big guns to complete the pincer movement around Yorktown and force the British surrender. The person next to him is shot and dies. He's there with Alexander Hamilton and Lafayette, but they're not right on the front lines. He's there. What prompts him? What prompts James Fortna, a free black kid, 9 years old, I think, when the Declaration was read in Philadelphia out loud for the first time a few days after July 4th? He didn't think that he knew that all of those self-evident truths applied to him. It wasn't just, and he fought for the Union and had a chance to have, when he was captured, to go back to England as the pet, the companion of the ship captain's son. He goes, no. And he gets sent to the Jersey, this notorious prison ship in the East River that the British made. Many people died. He barely made it out alive. Walked barefoot home to Philadelphia and said, Mom, I'm here. And I mean, what animates all of that? As James Fortin said, nowhere does God say that one race is higher than the other.
It's not unusual that I find myself talking to evangelical Christians who are fearful of becoming cynical and trying to work their way out of cynicism, but for a variety of reasons. But one, not long ago, was because of a history book. It was a young man who said, I grew up in kind of a Christian school where our American history Christian book had a very Christian nationalist sort of frame, arguing that the founders of the country were Christians and that they were establishing a Christian nation. And that all seemed very plausible to me until I grew up and started actually looking at the primary documents. And of course, there's an entire industry that goes around to churches and other places to say our founders were evangelical Christians, Orthodox Christians. How would you respond to that characterization?
It's just not true, and it's so much more interesting. It doesn't mean that they're not men of faith, or that the people aren't driven by deeply held spiritual concerns. As you know, many of the founders sort of gravitated, without necessarily throwing off their original, mostly Protestant denominations, into something which we call deism, which is sort of interesting. Jefferson is the most prominent, but Washington's susceptible to its charms, as is Franklin and many of the other people. It says that there is a God, but one disinterested in the day-to-day affairs of men. Let me go back to baseball. You've seen it when somebody hits a home run, and as they cross home plate, they look up and thank God, right? Mm-hmm. As if God had made that home run possible. They don't do that when they hit into a game-ending double play, right? So if you take the deist thought further, that there is this supreme architect, but disinterested in the affairs of man, that makes no distinctions between faiths plural, then you've got the ability to establish something that tolerates all the varieties, even within a Christian evangelical community, all the varieties and manifestations of that faith. And it permits people. So Jefferson famously said, if my neighbor believes in 20 gods or no God at all, it neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. And so what you find is the United States, founded in a moment of extraordinary tolerance and generosity, certainly within Protestant sects mostly, but there are, as I said, Catholics and others, and there are certainly the faiths of native peoples and enslaved Africans and free Africans and all sorts of stuff. The American Revolution, people forget, is a global war as well as a civil war, in addition to being this revolution. And what it is a revolution in ideas, and it is the first country established without an established religion. And it says it right there in the First Amendment. All you have to do is go to that. There are three things: freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. But the first one in that First Amendment is we'll make no establishment of a religion, so that there's breathing room to absorb the varieties of human experience. What they're saying is that if we are constantly telling others how to believe, we don't necessarily spend time perfecting ourselves. But in order to perfect ourselves, I need the breathing room for that to go on, to know who I am. I mean, I've said in all my films that I've made one film. It's all about the United States, with the exception of our film on Leonardo da Vinci, the previous one. They're all about the United States. And they're asking this simple question, who are we? And of course, as you know, that question, who are we, ultimately just comes down to who am I? And the more we sound that question, the more we understand that the opposite of faith is not doubt. That doubt is actually central to faith. The opposite of faith is certainty, right? certainty kills the mystery at the heart of our exploration of why we're here and what our purpose is and how we find and touch and understand God. It's interesting, and the founders mirror a lot of what I've just said.
You know, for those who were in a deist sort of strain and saw God as disinterested in the affairs of people, how then do the very same people often speak in very providential terms, as though something was happening, being guided? I mean, you think of inalienable rights by nature and nature's God, and you think about the kind of language about what's happening in this moment. Was that rhetorical, or
No, I don't think so. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think they see. I mean, in beginning in early parts, there's so much of the early whenever there was a success, it was always Providence had done this. You know, Washington talks about Providence, and the scholar Joseph Ellis said he probably doesn't believe in God in the way that you and I might, but he believes in Providence, and he's certain that there is some sort of divine purpose behind the revolution, and that the success of the revolution. Remember, at Lexington Green on April 19th, 1775, the chances of success are 0.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow 6.5 years later, outside of Yorktown, they're 100%. And a lot of what animates George Washington, for sure, is this sense that there is some providential force guiding this American experiment, right?
There had to be, of course, as we know, an alliance of people who are coming from multiple different perspectives. One of those perspectives being heavily influenced by the Enlightenment, but also people who were heavily influenced by Orthodox Christianity.
Yes.
How would they have gotten around? I mean, there are biblical passages such as Romans 13. Give obedience to the powers that be, to the established order. How would those people have been convinced to take up arms against their king?
What a beautiful question. Of course, and many did not, right? Many looked and said, all of my wealth, my education, my health, the fact that I own land where my family in England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland had worked as dependent farmers for 1,000 years, all of that has come from this British constitutional monarchy. Why would I ever want to give that up for this crazy lunatic idea? Two ministers in Boston are saying, who would you rather be ruled by, a tyrant 3,000 miles away or 3,000 tyrants not a mile away, meaning the mob of the boiling insurrection and resistance that would eventually lead to revolution? These are really fundamental questions. And I think the film helps pose that for folks. Like, what side would I have been on? We're trying, as I said, calling balls and strikes. We don't make the loyalists enemies. They came, often animated by purest religious fervor. But there are also those who, on the other side, feel that it's some other thing. They've enjoyed a kind of tolerance, or at least they've been able to gravitate to a colony that will take them. It might be the Catholic colony of Maryland. It might be, Rhode Island is significantly different from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and so is New York different from Rhode Island, and there are different varieties of Protestant sects that aren't Anglican. The Church of England in Baptists and Presbyterians and Methodists that are a lot of the stuff. There's one moment when a loyalist in South Carolina, a notorious leader of loyalist forces named Christian Huck, comes and tells a group of Presbyterians that if Jesus Christ came down and led the patriots, we would still defeat them. And they went, what? And they upped, and they eventually, when he took some hostages, a farm family hostage, they killed him and murdered him. And it was lawless anarchy in South Carolina and New Jersey as well, for a good deal of time as people were wrestling. We follow a Swedish minister in Swedesboro, appropriately New Jersey, Nils Collin, and he just in anguish watches his congregation split up, and he lists the indignities that are suffered by the loyalists by the patriots, and he lists the indignities that the patriots in his congregation have suffered at the hands of loyalists and British and others. And so you begin to realize that this was a roiling civil war as well as a revolution. And of course, there's empires on the edge of this, two Catholic empires, Spain and France, which France and Spain and the Netherlands, Protestant, come in on our side, principally France. But you have Catholic monarchies in Spain and France who are helping a Republican government try to overthrow another monarchy, which doesn't work out too well almost instantly for the French, right? Off with their heads. To see the revolution not just in the intimate terms of neighbors, which is important to do, not just in the terms we normally get, big ideas in Philadelphia, but in the terms of a civil war and these fundamental questions. Would I be willing to fight for this cause? Would I be willing to die for a cause? Would I be willing to kill for a cause? You know, these are all animating questions that the revolution stirs up, but also there's so many others involved at the global level that this is a world war, the fourth world war over the prize of North America, that it becomes hugely, hugely complicated. And of course, we've neglected to say, our film talks about it, all the people who don't want to choose sides. They just want to live life, you know, the libertarian, you would say, who just says, leave me alone. I just have got my patch of land. I've got my family. I've got my faith, perhaps, or not. And I just want to live here in this new Eden and do that. It's an incredibly dynamic and diverse and complicated set of things going on.
A lot of our listeners are exhausted by the fact that they're in congregations that are really divided over red-blue political divides, or even just the question of how central these political questions ought to be to their lives together. And they think we're not able to hang together right now, given this awful time. This film is sort of showing that that's not a unique and new development.
No, it's not. And it also shows you that we created the greatest country on earth by figuring out how to overcome those things, by understanding that compromise was important, that I had to listen to my neighbor. I didn't need to tell them. I go back to the Mark Twain. Nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits. You know, we are happy to tell everybody how they've got it wrong, and very infrequently look to ourselves or in the mirror and say, what do I need to do? And what the great beauty of the Republic was to create a place where there was breathing room for all sorts of varieties of opinions. If we hadn't figured out then how to come together and overcome those, we would have never been created. We will not survive unless we are willing to be able to extend that to everybody else. And what the founders point out, Jefferson does it too, is when they see that, for example, first Pennsylvania and New York established their state constitutions after the revolution begins without paying no mind. He said that usually when the state pays mind to religious differences and proclaims one right is where the state goes off the rails, and that how brilliant it was that they weren't going to do, and the problem seemed to disappear. And so we can go back to these documents. We can go back and parse them carefully, not in a dogmatic way, but in a way that says, I may not agree with you, but our whole dynamic is to figure out how do we coexist. I live in a tiny town in New Hampshire, and we get together, people of every possible political persuasion, religious persuasion, people who don't believe, and we figure out whether we want to buy a new fire truck. We figure out whether we're going to replace all the flags that we put out on Memorial Day and Veterans Day and the 4th of July. We figure out how to do these things together. That's the civic compact. And we were the first to figure out how to do that. And it works pretty well. But I can also tell you, having spent my entire professional life, now 50 years, telling stories about the United States, there's never been a period when we weren't divided. Sometimes more than another. Think of the Civil War, think of the Revolution, think of the Vietnam era. Sometimes now, in which the divisions seem to be building up and building up and building up. But as I say, I think going back in that helpful way, that figuring out what your childhood was like, who were your parents, where were you born, where'd you grow up, what do you feel, that you begin to realize that everybody has their own path to walk, and that my obligation is to do unto others as I would have them do unto me. And that's a really hard thing to get through. Sometimes we'd rather be distracted by doctrinal fine points than to realize how difficult it is to live up to even the most basic scripture.
One of the things that we've seen in recent weeks, or it's been highlighted in recent weeks, is how many people are influenced right now by a very different view of what America should be. You think of people who will refer to themselves in their social media bios as heritage American,
right,
meaning white.
To which you could immediately argue, heritage American would be Native Americans, right?
Right.
And then you've already sort of undercut a bit of that argument.
Well, this I can imagine someone in that category watching this film and saying, "Well, yes, they were able to create something new," and you, Ken Burns, in New Hampshire, you and your neighbors are able to come together and work through things because you have this common ethnicity, this common culture, and that can't work with a multi-ethnic, multicultural sort of United States that we have now.
It's not true. We are multi-ethnic up here, and we are also a country that came together because a lot of people. There were Native people who fought on our side. There were women who fought. There were freed and enslaved Black Americans who fought. There were Spanish who fought. There were French who fought. I mean, it was even the 13 colonies before the Revolution were about as diverse. It's like the bar in the first Star Wars movie, right? I mean, about as wild a place, and there pictures of walking down the streets of Philadelphia with lots of different Native American tribes. Nobody, they're not fighting one another. They're absorbed. They're assimilated. They're converted. They're coexisting. There are nations on the tribe, but they're so different from one another that they're like France or Prussia. You can't say them. I have had the great privilege, Russell, of making films about the U.S. for 50 years. I've also made films about us. That is to say, the two-letter, lowercase, plural pronoun, all of the intimacy of us and we and our, and all of the majesty, complexity, contradiction, and even controversy of the U.S. And if I have learned one thing, is that there's only us. There's no them. Now, we can go to Scripture and find arguments. I'm drawn to Ecclesiastes. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. Suggests that human nature doesn't change, and people like to say history repeats itself. Of course, it never does. No event has happened twice. Mark Twain, again, is supposed to have said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, which is pretty good, because what he's talking about are the rhymes of human nature, mostly our failings. Right, because history is mostly the sort of accumulation of conflict and things like that. You have other parts. It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to reach the kingdom of heaven. So that means, boom, what does that say? If we accept that completely as doctrinaire, right, it means that this whole idea of enriching yourself is in fact a fool's errand, that I need to be impoverished, I need to live like a Gandhi, or I need to live, sparsely, and to give everything away and to serve others, particularly those in need, as Mother Teresa to take a Christian example. we have all of that in front of us, and we also have this ability to reconcile the differences of opinion. So the idea that you could invent a kind of ultra-American through blood and soil and heritage and whatever, you just can't do it. The White House was built by enslaved labor, right?
Yeah.
The revolution was, the wealth of many of the colonies, and certainly all of the British colonies, they had 13 other colonies in the Caribbean, was all dependent on slave labor. Now, we want to go back to slavery. I mean, is that part of blood and heritage? Well, some people take it in that extreme too. And yet we've been able to operate for 249 plus years pretty well, given taking and understanding that the idea of America is one of a process verb, a kind of action verb. So we say pursuit of happiness. We focus on happiness because we're self-involved. The key is pursuit. It's lifelong learning. Right? We're more perfect union. How do you become more perfect? Right? So we're a nation in the process of becoming and trying to figure out. When Jefferson wrote all men are created equal, he meant all men of all white men of property free of debt. But by the end of the revolution, that meant a lot more people. Because in order to win that revolution, you'd extended it to people who didn't have that. And it was won by women, and it was won by enslaved people and Native American allies and other countries. So if you try to apply that kind of rigid certainty to things, it always goes off the rail. That's why I said earlier that I thought that the opposite of faith was not doubt, which was central. That question, what is it? Keeps you animated, but certainty. When you're absolutely certain, boom,
You mentioned earlier that despite all of these differences, doctrinally and in other ways, between the revolutionaries, that one of the things they had in common was the necessity of virtue and character. I think there are some people who, when they look at, for instance, Thomas Jefferson, the things that we know now about the way that he treated enslaved people, the Sally Hemings story, those kinds of things, would say, yeah, but was this virtue real? What was it instead kind of we want this for a virtuous and character-shaped common people. We need that.
Right.
But not for us.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, Russell. I think that's at the heart of it, and it again speaks to this desire on our part to say, sort of, either say it's like a switch. But the binary, there's no binaries except in computer code, 1 and a 0, and maybe in politics, red state, blue state, but my way or the highway. But everything else does not have that. So, if you want to flick the switch, you're going to have to lose everybody, because George Washington owned hundreds of human beings and gave people away as gifts, breaking up families, He also understood, as Thomas Jefferson understood, that slavery was wrong. And there's a wonderful moment in the film where, Annette Gordon-Reed, a black historian, one of the, great historians for years and years, had said, and wrote The Hemingses of Monticello, said that, how could you do something if you knew it was wrong? And she said, well, that's the human question for all of us. She's not letting Jefferson off the hook. Jefferson's on the hook. He knew it was bad. He said, slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears. You didn't like it, but you didn't dare let go. There was too much profit involved for all of these people to let it go. George Washington too, but he knew it was wrong. And by the end of his life, he directed the emancipation of his slaves in his will. I mean, it's one of the great things that he did, is not just serve as the general, not just give up his military, give up the presidency, but then on his deathbed, give up he knew this was wrong. And so I think what you see again is the process of human maturing. So when they say all men are created equal, the word all, the conservative scholar Yuval Levin said, that's it, that's the death knell. Now, slavery's done. Nobody's talking about slavery before the revolution. There are a few people saying it's bad. But during the revolution, now slavery is really bad. And it's going to take 89 years, and possibly a long time, for it to disappear. For women, it's 144 years before they're going to get the vote. I'm a father of 4 daughters. That's criminal in length. But It's going to happen. The walls of Jericho have been broken down by the pronouncements of this thing, and so we're just responsible of taking it and carrying it forward. And those who think you have to retrench and say it was really only this limited group of people don't know the story of not only the United States and its founding, but don't know the story of humanity. This is what it is. Think of the other alternatives. How did the Soviet experiment work? How did the Chinese experiment work? Their revolutions work.
You know, when I watched your documentary on country music, you could, through the series, see Hank Williams singing and Loretta Lynn singing. And when you did your Civil War series, you can see photographs of people. You had to do this without any photographs, any witnesses, any film, anything. How do you tell a story like that?
Yeah, so as you know, basically, you hit the nail on the head. This is the big challenge. We had to just recalibrate in a way. It was just 99.9% of people didn't have their portraits painted, so that meant they don't exist. No. You find new ways. They entered a role here, the citizen role. Their gravestone proves they existed. Ironically, their memoir that they left for their son or whatever. So you make them come alive in lots of different ways. And we decided that a normal, dislike of reenactments didn't mean you had to have some watch reenactors reenact a particular battle, but you could spend 5 or 6 years, as we did, collecting dozens and dozens of hours of people reenacting and treat them like the paintings and treat the paintings like their photographs. And then all of a sudden, you've got this impressionistic hands warming by a fire at Valley Forge, or you've got people trudging through the snow, or the heat of Monmouth Courthouse battle. And so you realize you're not reenacting it, you're bringing in imagery that speaks to it, and you make it come alive. It really helps also to have what I think is the best cast ever assembled for any movie or any television series. About 60 people of the highest caliber, the Tom Hankses, the Meryl Streeps, the Morgan Freemans of the world, who are reading off camera and making people come alive. Not just the George Washingtons and the Thomas Jeffersons, as Josh Brolin and Jeff Daniels do, but Mercy Otis Warren, a philosopher and historian and satirist of the time. Whoever did you know the first history of the Revolution was written by a woman? So there's wonderfully destabilizing. That's why I have that sign in my editing room. It's complicated because just when you have a scene, it's working, it's perfect, whatever. Don't touch it, and then you find that sometimes the opposite is true. Right? Also true, right? That's what Wynton Marsalis said in our jazz film. Sometimes the thing and the opposite of a thing are true at the same time. And I'll go back to country music and tell you, what if you picked the Mount Rushmore of country music? You take Jimmy Rogers and the Carter family, A.P. Carter. You take Johnny Cash and obviously Hank Williams and Bill Monroe. Okay, that's a lot, more than Mount Rushmore has. Every single one of those people, at the epitome of the heights of country music, all had black mentors. We think of country music now as a kind of white, kind of American, kind of what you're saying, heritage kind of music, folk music. But A.P. Carter is traveling out with a guy named Riddle, who is finding songs for him. And they're taking songs from the black community and the white community, and they're making the big hits of the Carter family. Jimmy Rogers said everything he learned from the bluesmen on the radio, on the railroads in Mississippi and Alabama. Hank Williams, the hillbilly Shakespeare, said that everything he learned about music he got from Rufus T-Tot Payne, who was a black itinerant bluesman. Johnny Cash said the same thing about Gus Cannon. And one of Bill Monroe, who invents a whole style of music, bluegrass, gets it not only from his uncle, but also from a guy named Arnold Schultz, who was a black man touring. So all of a sudden, this one thing music turns out to be a many thing music. And that's the strength of the United States. You remember our Latin, motto, e pluribus unum, out of many one. And today, there's too much pluribus and not enough unum. And I am in the unum business. That's what I have spent the last 50 years saying. You have more in common than you have more apart. All of the great moments have been when we have come together to coalesce regardless of differences to make a difference in the world.
Is it possible to do that now in this kind of media ecosystem? I think about being in the 7th grade and we had to memorize the preamble to the Constitution for civics class. And the teacher had to say, you can't sing it. Because everybody at that age had all grown up with Schoolhouse Rock
Exactly.
and the preamble. We all had seen the same thing. Now, there's such a fragmented sense of people are receiving news from everywhere. They're consuming content from everywhere. And I can't imagine a political leader in the United States right now able to come up with a Latin slogan. Not over the country.
First of all, we already have one. So let's just say that, okay? So that we're not changing it. That's what it is. You're absolutely right. I think the greatest threat is that proliferation. When I was growing up, same thing. You had 3 networks, an independent station and a PBS station. You know, even if you didn't watch the news, everybody watched the nightly news. Everybody read the local newspaper and maybe one of the great national newspapers. And so we had the same information. Now it's fragmented like the Sorcerer's Apprentice with hundreds and thousands and millions of different places, which they don't have fact-checking departments. They can lead poor people down rabbit holes of incredibly toxic varieties. You know, we learn sometimes among people who have committed horrible crimes that they were, had followed this for years and had come to believe this, when just simply pulling them up and saying, look, this is what it is. 1 and 1 equals 2. Right? 2 and 2 equals 4. And the only place in which 1 and 1 equals 3 is in our faith and in our art and in our love, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That's the only place. And these chasing these invented things. I mean, this is what authoritarianism is about. It wants a superstitious peasantry. It wants people distracted and consumed by ideology and old tropes, whereas to be a citizen in a democracy is to be willing to say, I could change my mind because your argument is good. I disagree with you still, but I really respect your right, Russell, to say that. And what we feel is that part of the atmosphere of our social media environment doesn't permit us to do that. And of course, I've said for years, social media isn't. Like, if you've ever been in a room, and I don't want to blame it on teenagers or anybody, and they're all on their, everybody's looking down like this. Yeah. How is that social?
Yeah.
And what is it that you got your information? I sometimes have to, I've got grown daughters and I've got who didn't have that, but young daughters who are part of that, and they'll come up and say, "This is, the moon is made of green cheese." Okay, so let me go and tell you what the moon is comprised of, right? And we can just, they're not saying that, but you know what I'm saying? The equivalent of just the certainty that something is this way, when in fact it's often the exact opposite or something else altogether, or sometimes so complex that it has many different aspects to it. And so if you can imagine the old parable of the blind men, describing the elephant, we now have billions of blind men describing one part of the elephant. They get one thing right, but they get most of it wrong.
It seems to me when I hear you talk about this film and also the rest of your work that you have something of a calling. What is your spiritual sort of grounding in practices?
I was born Episcopalian and Methodist a little bit on one side, mostly Episcopalian, and my mom went there. I can see her belting out of tune. My mom died when I was 11. I sang in the choir at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. I go down every Christmas and we go to the Congregational Church and we do a candlelight service and we sing, and then we go out into the town green where the Congregational Church has a live nativity, and I mean a live nativity. Who's ever the youngest baby, boy or girl, is Jesus, and their parents are Mary and Joseph, and they're animals there, and we sing. And it's cold, right? It's New Hampshire on Christmas. And so I'm very much animated by a sense and a power of Jesus. But I am not, as he would not want me to, using it as a weapon.
What advice would you give to Christians as to how to live up to the principles of the American Revolution while still holding their faith?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive in any way. I'd say hold to the true parts of your faith and start at the very beginning. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, period. I think we're just as we look at another great religion, say, look at the Muslim religion. Forget about how the politics of the last, 30 years or 50 years or 150 years has clouded that. This was once the epitome of civilization during our dark ages. Mathematicians, astronomers, religious philosophers, they were there. And we see in which how doctrinal divisions between them corrupted and changed that regime. They're human beings too. And if you think that if you were born in Iran and that you'd be a Christian, you're sadly mistaken. If you think if you were born in Saudi Arabia, that you'd be anything but a Sunni Muslim, you're really mistaken. That circumstance is 90% of the game. Where did I end up? And then it becomes, can you see the great faiths as tributaries of the same river flowing into the same sea of this oneness with God? That's where the deists were trying to say, hey, look, guys, if you get totally distracted by these doctrinal things, you've missed the central thing of treating others the way you would want them to treat you, of the kindness, of the generosity, the teachings of, even Jefferson, for all of that deist stuff, he made what he called the Jefferson Bible. He just took out all the stuff that wasn't Jesus talking.
Yeah.
Right?
Not my favorite Jefferson moment, but
no. Right.
I take your point.
Yeah, and of course, most of the Gospels are written well after Jesus' death. So, as we know, if you play a game of telephone around the table at Thanksgiving, the things get changed awful lot. And so what we have to do is look for the essence of it. And it's there in a children's smile, in the dawn, in the dew on the leaf, in each other's, and our empathy and love for them. I have a political yard sign, Russell, out in my front yard. I'll send you a picture of it. It says, love multiplies. That's what I vote for. That's the law of the universe, right? That's it.
Well, we might, like the founding generation, disagree on some of the theology of this, but we can agree on this American project, and I'm really thankful for your work. The series, The American Revolution, premieres November 16th on PBS. Ken Burns, perhaps the greatest filmmaker in American history. I look forward to what you have for us next. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. So kind. I can't wait to get to it. I'm looking forward to sharing this all starting November 16th. And remember, you can stream it for free starting then, the whole thing. And I'm so grateful and feel blessed for being able to spend this hour with you, Russell. Thank you.
Thank you.